Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. After weeks of growing pressure and with cases rising rapidly, the Canadian government is taking steps to secure the border. Ottawa is barring most foreigners except Americans from entering Canada, and only 4 Canadian airports will be allowed to accept international flights.
And now is the time to take this particular step. It is a significant step. It is a step that we take in exceptional circumstances, but it is the right step to be taking today.
As part of the new restrictions, the Prime Minister says any Canadians who are abroad and have COVID-19 symptoms will not be allowed to board flights home. He's urging people to do their part to help slow the spread.
Let me be clear. If you're abroad, it's time for you to come home. If you've just arrived, you must self-isolate for 14 days. And finally, all Canadians, as much as possible, should stay home.
The situation in Canada is changing quickly. Here's what we can tell you. As of right now, there are more than 410 cases across the country. BC, Ontario, and Quebec all recorded double-digit increases today. And the number of deaths has jumped from 1 to 4 after 3 more people died in BC. They're all linked to a North Vancouver care home. The situation in the U.S. and Europe is escalating. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, what's happening here at home as the government ramps up its response to the outbreak. Mike Armstrong has tonight's top story.
Stepping out of Rideau Cottage, where he's in self-isolation with his family, the Prime Minister basically closed the country to most of the world. Canadians will still be allowed to return home, citizens and permanent residents, but starting Wednesday, Canada will be denying entry to most foreign nationals. There are exceptions for people like airline crews and diplomats, but also one very big group, U.S. citizens. Despite an increase in cases south of the border, the Prime Minister isn't cutting off access to Americans for now.
We recognize that the level of integration of our two economies and the coordination that we've had over the past while puts the U.S. in a separate category from the rest of the world. But we will continue to coordinate with the U.S. We will continue to examine next steps and measures that must be taken.
Now, getting on planes to come home to Canada will also get tougher. Airlines are being ordered to refuse access to anyone with symptoms, things like a cough or a fever.
Any passenger, regardless of citizenship, with possible COVID-19 symptoms will not be allowed to board flights to Canada.
There are changes coming to where planes arrive back in Canada. Most international flights are going to be funneled to 4 airports: Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. There are exceptions. Flights from the U.S., Mexico, and the Caribbean are not affected, but again, with that disclaimer, for now. Ottawa's making it very clear things could get even tighter at any time.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Now, Ottawa's reaction at the border comes after some criticism. There's been pressure from several premiers that the federal government wasn't taking the threat from international travelers seriously enough. The frustration was so strong in Quebec that the city of Montreal sent public health officials to the airport to remind travelers they should self-isolate for 14 days. Now, there is new increased screening at airports. International travelers are having to answer questions on CBSA kiosk touchscreens. They have to say whether they have symptoms and acknowledge they know they have to self-isolate for 2 weeks. For the first time, there are new extra border guards at airports looking for travelers with symptoms. That's something critics have been calling for days. Border guards are also being given masks to hand out when they're concerned with someone's health. Robin?
Mike Armstrong in Ottawa. Thanks, Mike. Canada's Chief Medical Health Officer says the new travel restrictions are needed to try to slow the spread of COVID-19. But one big question, why are Americans exempt? Abigail Bimman looks at that angle tonight.
Travelers flow through Toronto's Pearson Airport, one of 4 that will remain open to international flights when new restrictions come into force.
You got to do proper screening to make sure everything's straight, so you don't want to keep sending it back and forth.
And for now, flights between Canada and the U.S. are not restricted.
We have been collaborating very closely with the United States.
But with such a high number of COVID-19 cases south of the border, British Columbia, for one, wants a tougher ban. Washington State has seen the most deaths.
It's our strong message that visitors from the United States not come to British Columbia. Don't come at this moment. That is the wrong thing to do.
That Canada-US border in particular is a lifeline for both of our countries. This is a situation which we are reviewing constantly in real time.
With a volatile American president who may not take kindly to a shutdown, Ottawa says Canadian leaders made the decision on their own, and it may change. Ministers point to the food supply chain as a critical thing to protect. Truck drivers and others who rely on cross-border life are also exempt from the 14-day requirement to self-isolate when they return.
If we put in measures for mandatory self-isolation, as many people have looked for, there would need to be enforcement measures around that, both by public health and by public safety.
No plans to do that yet. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
Parents across most of Canada are now scrambling to find alternate arrangements for their children. Nearly every province and territory is closing schools and daycares. Alberta and Saskatchewan say they likely won't reopen until the fall. Heather Yourex-West looks at why the extended break is necessary.
It says every grade 12 will graduate.
It wasn't the news 18-year-old Macy Fields had hoped for.
Pretty much instantly started crying. It was just such this scary thought to think that school is just canceled for the rest of the year.
As a grade 12 student, canceled classes in Alberta means Fields' high school days are suddenly done, and graduation plans are now up in the air.
Time is running out to flatten the curve. That's why today we are announcing that effective immediately, we are suspending all in-school class instruction throughout the province.
Every student will receive a final grade based on their current grade, and students will progress to their next grade level.
Across Saskatchewan, students are now abruptly ending their school years as well. Daycares are closing too. The longer-term shutdown coming in contrast to provinces like Ontario, where, for the most part, classes are suspended for just a few weeks.
I'll take my advice off the Chief Medical Officer. If he feels that is necessary, then we'll follow that advice. Right now, we've closed them till April the 6th.
Infectious disease experts say parents should not bet on schools and daycares reopening anytime soon.
2.5 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, when everything may be ramping up again, I think we'll see that we're really in the thick of it. And my guess is that those 2-week bans are likely to be extended.
For parents unable to work from home, the scramble to find childcare is on. Quebec officials are promising to provide 60,000 daycare spaces for those who provide essential services. But elsewhere, most parents are on their own. Back in Calgary, Fields knows the demand for babysitters now will be great. And with school out, she's available to lend a hand. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
We know you have lots of questions about the virus. Our Jeff Semple will consult with experts and try to answer them. So email us at yourquestions@globalnews.ca, and our website has a special page dedicated entirely to the new coronavirus.